Thank you so much. What I will be presenting today is kind of a best of several presentations during the last 1.5 years. It is basis of my PhD thesis, which I will be starting soon, hopefully, actually writing it. Well, I think I'll just start and we do questions after that. So, my thesis is A, that modes of translation within theosophical society are informed by two different epistemologies, and B, that this reflects an inner discourse on how to access knowledge, occult knowledge as we already heard, and C, that translating and interpreting the Gita became a central feature in inner theosophical negotiations on heterodoxy and orthodoxy, because linguistic skills, most importantly knowing Sanskrit on the one hand and claims on clairvoyance on the other, became the cardinal qualities of a theosophist claiming authority on occult knowledge. And D, that Annie Besant and her Gita translations had a major impact on the Indian freedom movement. Examining Shokla 250 of the Gita in Annie Besant's translation shall illustrate some basic difficulties of translational process. Furthermore, I will show that reviews on Besant's Bhagavad Gita translations went along the lines of the two epistemologies mentioned. Considering her 1907 edition, I will ponder on questions of heterodoxy and orthodoxy within the TS. And finally, by pointing to the uptake of her Bhagavad Gita translations and interpretation, I will point to her impact on Indian nationalism. Firstly, I would like to talk about Besant's several Bhagavad Gita editions by focusing on Shloka 250 of the Bhagavad Gita. We can see in her several translations, if we compare these translations from 1895, 1904, 1905 and 1907, several things stand out. A, from 1895 to 1904, the term Buddhi, which remains an untranslated term, and I really want to focus on that one because we can't do all of it now. The term Buddhi is then in 1904 only given as a footnote. And from 1904 to 1905, the footnote vanishes. Instead, the Devanagari script here is given, and all the sandhis are solved and explained. The explanation and sandhis, they're vanishing in the 1907 version. Let me illustrate some lines of argumentation that might explain these changes. If we look at the first one, two comments from philosophical periodicals show that Besant's 1895 translation was widely discussed and criticized. In the September issue of The Path, the journal of the American branch of the TS, an anonymous writer comments, "Another translation of this is out. It is Mrs. Besant's. There is no excuse for it. It pretends to be literal. It is half and half. Some years ago, Mohini Chatterjee brought out a closely literal translation, much better, of course, than this, as he is a Brahman, well educated in Sanskrit and English, and Mrs. Besant began to learn the Sanskrit alphabet in about 1891. This comment is not only a manifestation of the growing tension between Adya philosophy and the American branch, but it also reflects on the question of how to access occult knowledge. I will come to that a little later. Another verdict from the October of the same year by an anonymous writer in the Irish Philosophist is as devastating as that one. There we can read, "An accomplishment Mrs. Besant had not acquired is the writing of good English. Her sentences are often tortured and involved beyond reason or grammar, and sometimes are simply barbarous, an effect due to her habit of leaving Sanskrit words in a state of semi-translation." Already 1 year later, in 1896, Besant published a new and revised edition of her Gita. In this version, the term buddhi did not yet vanish. However, many other semi-translated terms were adapted into English. And in her 1904 edition, which was yet the already fourth version of Besant's Bhagavad Gita, buddhi was adapted to the term pure reason. Besant explains her decision to leave Sanskrit terms untranslated in her preface to the Gita translation from 1895 and 1896. There she writes, in order to gain something of the precision of Sanskrit, a few technical but fairly familiar terms have been given in the original. This reflects her claim on knowing Sanskrit and understanding the original meaning, the real meaning of the Sanskrit terms through her occult insight. In addition, Besant also contested with her translation from 1895 and 1896 two things. A, the American section, as she offered an alternative translation to Chach's translation from 1890. And B, Indian theosophists, who were the Bhagavad Gita experts, as Eric Sharpe puts it, in the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita uptake within the Theosophical Society. In her 1904 version, then, she renders most of the terms in Sanskrit with English translations. The Sanskrit terms are only given in footnotes. Consequently, she changes her preface and writes, in order to preserve the precision of the Sanskrit, a few technical terms have been given in original in footnotes. I argue that she, by rendering Sanskrit terms through English terms and giving them in footnotes, could define the specific Sanskrit terms and therefore claiming her understanding of Sanskrit better than others. As for her 1905 edition, we need to know a little bit of its background. In 1898, Besant founded, together with Bhagavad Das and others, the Central Hindu College in Varanasi. You might be aware of that. Bhagavad Das was a learned pundit, and Besant published her 1905 version together with him, which indicates that this version, this edition, might have been intended to be some sort of study version for the college in Varanasi. Therefore, it includes an introduction to Sanskrit, and the script itself is examined as done in the Pandit tradition. And as for the 1907 version, one could argue that it was meant to be an authoritative edition, as Besant became the president of the Theosophical Society earlier in 1907, before the Gita was published. And now, before I will talk about Indian nationalism and her claiming authority to this 1907 version, I'd like to point out why translations are vehicles for negotiations on authority. Therefore, I like to zoom in on that shloka 250, and let's have a look at the Devanagari script. I'd like you to draw your attention to one word in particular, which is buddhi-yukta, which becomes buddhi-yuktas when the sandhi is solved. In Das and Besant's interpretation, it is solved as buddhi-yuktaha and translated with knowledge endowed. And in her final adaptation, she chooses the term united to pure reason. And now let's focus on that buddhi thing again. To strengthen my point, I like to show two alternative translations, one from Mohini Chatterjee from 1887 and one from Charles Johnson from 1908. Right, these are two. Chatterjee renders buddhi-yuktas as united to yoga. Really the same thing as Besant writes. And explains in a footnote that yoga is an interior state of peace produced by devotion or spiritual knowledge. Charles Johnson, on the other hand, renders it as united to soul vision, which is again something quite different, I would say. Firstly, we notice that there are several renderings of the same verse, and this points to some basic difficulties of translation. A word in language A might have several possible renderings in language B. Of course, context helps deciding what an appropriate rendering might be. However, in cases where terms like buddhi relate to a wide range of concepts, choosing the appropriate term becomes far more difficult. And these difficulties, or I like to call them blank spaces, are the spaces where the interpretation of the translator is the only point of reference. These blank spaces leave room for the translator to project his or her interpretations on the text. However, these renderings are not completely arbitrary, as they are negotiated within a discursive continuum, including experts, Indian experts, consulting commentaries on the Gita and referring to Sanskrit grammars and previous translations. Now this leads us to the question of epistemologies within the Theosophical Society. I'd like to show you two extracts, one extract from philosophical writings, first an extract from Isis Unveiled. Blavatsky writes in there, the work now submitted to the public judgment is the fruit of somewhat intimate acquaintance with Eastern adepts and the study of their science. It is offered to such as are willing to accept truth wherever it may be found and to defend it, even looking popular with justice, straight in the face. Truth, high-seated, upon its rock of Dhamma, is alone, eternal and supreme. I'd like to draw your attention to three words, which are adepts, truth in normal letters, and truth in capital letters. These three concepts form the basis of philosophical thought. The adepts were conceptualized as human beings who were so advanced on an evolutionary scale that they had a direct connection to the astral plane. Their evolutionary superiority on the one hand and the educational approach to teach their wisdom to others marked the difference between the two epistemological approaches. One, an esoteric mystical approach, as I call them, and two, an exoteric empirical approach. The first is clairvoyance insight into truth with capital letters, high truth, which only can be gained by an evolutionary process through many cycles of reincarnation. And the second is connected to the idea of education as key to really revealing truth in small letters. These two epistemologies are also mentioned in Mead's review on Besant's Gita from 1895. In Lucifer, he wrote, a six-penny Gita, such is the last experiment tried by my colleague, and it seems to be succeeding excellently. If you not just think about the comments before, I have carefully gone through Annie Besant's translation and find it not only imbued with the spirit of the original, but also capable of standing to criticism of scholars. Mead comments on Besant's translation referring to imbued with spirit and standing to criticism of scholars. Therein, both epistemologies become apparent. On the one hand, the translation imbues the spirit through some kind of mystical connection, and on the other hand, the translation is considered a scholarly correct version based on philological criteria. These dimensions are concerned with orthodoxy and heterodoxy as they reflect on the question, what is a good and therefore correct translation, and who can, by philological ideas and by clairvoyance, go to this occult knowledge behind Sanskrit and other scriptures. I'd like to examine that point in more detail on Besant's Bhagavad Gita translations. Which I already did, but we can see in the Philosophical Glossary from 1892, one can read for the term buddhi, which is Sanskrit, and is the universal soul or mind as the spiritual soul in man, the sixth principle, the vehicle of Atman. As we have seen, and now that's the point where it's negotiations on authority or heterodoxy and orthodoxy. As we have seen, Besant published 6 different versions of the Gita until 1907. In her first versions, she leaves buddhi untranslated, when in her 1904 she renders it with pure reason, and with this translation she redefines the term buddhi, and her 1907 version, where this translation wasn't altered, was reprinted several times up to 1922. The first print had a run from 10,000 copies, the second 20,000, and the third like 50,000, and the last only a small one, 5,000 copies. However, it seems that until 1911, Besant's edition became the authoritative Bhagavad Gita translation among Adyar theosophists. This is also reflected in the Dictionary of some Philosophical Terms from 1910. Because buddhi is then redefined in that dictionary. There we can read, buddhi, again from Sanskrit, is the monad of self in its activity as spiritual discernment or cognition, and now follows an Besant quotation. Buddhi is the faculty above rationating mind, as is the pure reason, the rendering of the Bhagavad Gita of Besant, exercising the discernative faculty of intuition or spiritual discernment. Quotation from Besant. For Besant's Bhagavad Gita translation, we can say that several factors made it authoritative. Excuse me. Firstly, her Gita was widely discussed in philosophical magazines. Secondly, her version was most likely used as a scholarly version for students. And finally, her Gita was published in vast numbers. Furthermore, her 1907 version was not only meant to be an authoritative version within the Philosophical Society, but a popular edition for the English-educated Indian gentry. This becomes apparent in the editor's preface of 1907. There one can read, "It has long been my ambition to place within an easy reach of the English public, thank you so much, of the English public, a cheap edition of the Bhagavad Gita with the text in Devanagari and an English translation of the same. Mrs. Annie Besant, that warm and tired friend of India, whose service to our land it were vain to count, has enabled me to realize that ambition by generously granting the use of her English translation. It is devotedly hoped that this great scripture of the Hindus will find a place in thousands of homes, both in India and elsewhere." Well, her 1907 version was not, as most other philosophical translations were, published by a philosophical, but by an Indian publishing house. Thereby, Besant could not only present herself as the president of the Philosophical Society, but as well as Indian benefactor. This brings us to the uptake of Besant's Gita translations within the Indian national movement. In 1906, Besant published a commentary on the Gita called Hints on the Study of the Bhagavad Gita, in which she explains the message of the Gita as twofold. On the one hand, is referring to history, and on the other hand, is referring to allegory. On the side of allegory, Besant understands the Gita as Yoga Shastra that teaches the pupil ultimate yoga. Hence, allegory is understood as an inner meaning, a meaning for the individual. She draws her interpretation mainly from the concept of karma yoga and therefore focuses on action. However, the historical meaning is more important for my argumentation today, therefore I will focus on its historical meaning. Her main theme, Besant's main theme, is the history of India, and she explains within the commentary In the past of her, India's story, this first offshoot of the Aryan race had settled in the northern parts of India. It had there served as a model, the world model for a nation. After that, according to the plan of the Logos, as Besant phrases it, India was to be humiliated. And she writes that the destroying waves of invasion might sweep over her time after time. One European nation after another played with the dice of war and commerce of the ruling of India. Then she goes on and declares, he, the avatar of Krishna, guides his chosen through the valley of misery and the hell of humiliation, in order that, purified by suffering, enriched by the experience gathered from many nations who came to mingle with her own, the world Savior might arise glorious in the morning of resurrection, to shed new light over the world instead of light being shed on one nation only. I think it's quite safe to say that Besant appeals to Indian nationalism in declaring India as the next world savior. Her comment on the Gita, together with her vastly printed Bhagavad Gita translation, set the ground for their uptake within Indian nationalism, which I will talk about now for a few minutes. Let's turn our attention to that uptake. Besant's translation and commentary became important to Mahatma Gandhi's interest in the Gita. He writes in his autobiography, towards the end of my second year in England, I came across two theosophists. They talked to me about the Gita. I began reading the Gita with them. I recall having read Madame Blavatsky's Key to Theosophy. This book stimulated in me the desire to read books on Hinduism. Still, at the beginning of the 20th century, Gandhi reads and studies the Gita along with theosophists in South Africa, where he had Besant's Gita reprinted and distributed among Indians. However, Gandhi parted ways with the theosophists later. The Gita, with a philosophical subtext, remained central to his ideas of an Indian nation. Another instance of the uptake of the Bhagavad Gita within Indian nationalism, which was at least partly mediated through the Theosophical Society, was within the Benares Hindu University. Sorry. The university was established in 1916, and its founders, Pandit Valaviya and Annie Besant, implemented Sunday morning Gita classes and compulsory religious instruction. Within this context, the Gita became a symbol for Hindu nationalists among students. The Gita was carried around and displayed to refer to that specific idea of Hindu nationalism. We can talk about that particular thing maybe a little later. It's not yet sure that really Besant's translation was read within the Benares Hindu University, but I think it might be so, because Annie Besant was one of the founders of the university, and she also wrote textbooks for religious education within the Benares Hindu University, where translations of her are in those textbooks. So, I might be pretty fast, because I'm already concluding. As I pointed out, translations were widely discussed within the Theosophical Society. And I argue that the interest in these translations stemmed from the central philosophical question of how to access occult knowledge. Therefore, translations become essential proof of authority, and I furthermore pointed out that translations are no one-to-one adaptations of an original, but specific forms of text interpretations. Hence, if a translation becomes authoritative a certain line of understanding is put forward. Even more so if these translations form the basis for education, as I claim is true for Besant's Bhagavad Gita translation. In addition, we can see that Besant's translation were cardinal to Mahatma Gandhi's Bhagavad Gita reception and the religious instruction within the Benares Hindu University. Further research might reveal how Besant's philosophy influenced Indian concepts of Hinduism by the uptake of her Gita translations within the Indian educational system. And thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for this fascinating talk, into those translations by Besant and the way they were reviewed. I'm sure there'll be questions. I'm going just to start about Gandhi, Gandhi
yeah.
and the Gita. So I read Gandhi's autobiography, and the chronology is a bit fuzzy, so it's difficult to know. But what I gathered was that he read the Gita for the first time when he was in London.
Yeah.
And actually that was just when Besant had joined the Theosophical Society.
Right.
So the Gita he read, I don't think it could have been the one translated by Besant.
No, it was Arnold's edition,
Okay.
Edwin Arnold's edition, and he read it with Knightley Brothers, I think. Anyways, you're absolutely right. He didn't read Besant's translation at the time.
At the time, yes.
But he used it in South Africa, and he even had it printed with a portrait of Besant in it.
Okay, thank you for clarifying
Yeah.
this. Thank you so much. Any questions? Yes, Kurt.
A couple of points. One is that use of the word clairvoyance to talk about the very first translation, you might want to think carefully about that. It's documented that her first experiences of clairvoyance didn't happen until 1895.
Right.
And I think it would be safe to say that she was using her intuition. Much later, there's a comment by Leadbeater about the series of theosophical manuals that she wrote also in the 1890s, and that she began by quoting Blavatsky extensively in the first couple, and then by the end she was actually talking from her own clairvoyant experience. And this spread from about 1892 to about 1896. So it's, and she deals extensively with the word buddhi in those works. So it might be of interest to you to explore the evolution of the concept. In the work that I wrote, Invisible Worlds, I traced about a 20-year period of the evolution of her idea of Blavatsky's borrowing of Sanskrit terminology and her desire to translate it into English in effective ways. And so that quotation that was used in the 1910 Theosophical Dictionary, that comes from the preface to the 1895 edition, where she makes the Clear Reason translation. It just wasn't included in the text itself. And furthermore, the quote at the top needs to be understood in the context of her own ideas having gotten far enough away from Blavatsky's original definitions that it was necessary for her to come up with some kind of hybrid definition.
Well,
these are really only just suggestions,
yeah.
and I'd be happy to explore them with you later.
I can't really comment on that, and I'm really happy for your points. Actually, that's why I'm here, because
Yes.
you are really the experts on these things, and you know every little nuances. Yeah, I'll be happy to exchange some ideas about that. Thank you so much.
One last little thing. That idea of clear reason, I discovered it's also in my talk tomorrow. She borrowed it from the translation of Plato's Republic that was most popularly read at that time as a translation of nous. And so there's even yet another interesting cross-cultural reference. Yeah.
Oh, we have 2 minutes left, so maybe just one other question? Yes.
Small one. If I remember it correctly, Besant strongly disliked her image being used by Gandhi. Why was that so? Because I never found an explanation for that.
I think there is no proper explanation for it, but Gandhi just didn't ask her. He just reprinted it, and he didn't sell it, but he just reprinted it, and he didn't ask. And then he said, "Well, it's just out of devotion to you, Mrs. Besant, that I did that." But I don't really know if there's more to the story.
It might just have been that the picture wasn't as flattering as she would have liked. Because that's always my problem with pictures. I used the one of 40 years ago, please.
But Gandhi insisted on this, picture thing, because in his autobiography he says that he had a picture of her in his office in South Africa, and he writes it down. So apparently that was important to him. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So the next talk is by Alan Johnson. Here you are. I couldn't see you. Thank you. Thank you.